All right, sweet. Hello, everyone. Welcome back once again. It is a wonderful, wholesome Monday. I just ended up submitting our game for the Independent Games Festival yesterday. Well, get this. Okay, so this is how it works. Tell me this isn't Russian roulette. So, you submit your game before midnight, and then they're going to be judging all the games, and they'll announce on the 11th of January who won. But you're allowed to submit an update to your game as many times as you want until then, but you don't know when the judge is going to check it out. So we can just pretty much do any sort of changes we want, but we never have any idea when on earth they're going to look at it. So right now we don't actually have an avatar. We have like a pill. Whenever you move around, you just have this like pill that teleports around the screen. Hoping to fix that this week. Hopefully we don't get judged this week, but that's currently what's going on in my life. Today we're going to be looking at Backho versus Han. It's another Protoss versus Protoss. We looked at Zhangbi versus Pusan yesterday, and the reason I chose this Protoss versus Protoss is because the map is so different. It's actually Fighting Spirit. Let's go ahead and take a brief look at the map. And again, I really, really hope that we don't end up crashing anything this time, because Livestream did die once or twice in the other stream, so I got everything set up once again. That's why it took a little bit longer this time, but hopefully nothing too bad happens. So let's just briefly look at this. I mean, look how wide open the natural expansion is. On Destination, you have these two narrow bridges instead of a fat bridge. So as a result, you can it's a little bit harder to defend on Fighting Spirit, because this is so much wider. Because you have the two thin bridges on Destination, you can do something like go 2 Gateway Dragoon to defend your expansion, but here, you end up needing to get Reavers a little bit earlier. Or I guess I should say, it's a little bit harder to skip Reavers on this map, and to go straight for like Templar tech and for Zealots with speed and that sort of thing. So you end up just needing a bigger army earlier on to take your first expansion, and your second expansion is a little bit harder to take itself. Because if you end up taking this expansion, I mean, how are you going to take your third or your fourth? You really need some huge center army in order to move out effectively. So we're going to see a lot of that have influence in the rest of the game. So let's go ahead and mute the chat and begin the game. Just jump right into things. So we have Han spawning at the top right. We can always tell because we don't need to know the player names. We just need to know the team names. We know that Han's on NBC, so he's the red Protoss at the top right, which makes Backho at the bottom left. Gonna have a wholesome drink of my delicious, opaque Los Angeles tap water. Already we see a few interesting choices by some of the players. The fact that they're building their first pylon not inside their mineral patch. A lot of players will build either their first, second, sometimes their third pylon at some place like here. Because, for instance, if you build a pylon here or here, you block the manor pylons. And manor pyloning is just such a pain in the ass. There's actually some maps that end up being more convenient to manor pylon, and on those, players definitely build their first gateways. Their first pylons in their mineral line, just so they can build the gateway and the nexus on the other side. Ends up being really, really tight, cramped building placement. So here's something I do want to talk about that we don't get to spend a lot of time talking about in the other matchups, but because this game is so long, it conveniently fits in really nicely, is scout timing. Notice that Backho is scouting right after his gas, and we have Han scouting right after he builds his gateway. Always try to make sure that your scouting has some goal. Some players just tend to default auto-scout at some point. Like, for instance, I've seen players who just always scout after they build their gateway. Or players who scout always after they build their pylon. But in a lot of circumstances, that's not necessary. If you don't have some deviation that necessitates you scouting your opponent, you don't really need to scout early. That's probably why Backho is scouting so much later here, and why we have Han scouting so much earlier. Han probably needs to know something in order to make a specific change. And a lot of times in Protoss versus Protoss, 2-gating is a totally legitimate option. A lot of players like 2-gating a lot. I know Noni's a huge fan of 2-gating in like every matchup. But because 2 gating such a realistic possibility, players end up getting the first Zealot out much earlier. Even if they are going for some sort of fast cybernetics core, sometimes you'll see players do something where they'll cut probes, and even though they'll be doing something similar to what Backho's doing here, where they're getting the very fast cybernetics core, they'll cut probes here and just get the Zealot out early, because it's so important to not die to any sort of early Zealot. Yeah, see, there's a Zealot popped out right there. It's important not to die to any sort of 2-gate Zealot push, or just to have a Zealot end up in your base. That's the classic standard early harassment in Protoss vs. Protoss, sending a Zealot and a probe to your opponent's base early, because the probe and the Zealot kills an opponent's probe in 2 hits. So we see the Cybernetics Core doing the researching as usual. In Terran vs. Protoss, you end up seeing things where... oh, that guy looks so much like I Love Uv. Holy cow. Well, he's a little bit chubbier, but still, my God, I actually thought that was the coach. Just taking a nice little relaxing day to watch some random teams play. But in Terran vs. Protoss, sometimes you'll do something where you research range, but you cancel once the scout is killed. In Protoss vs. Protoss, it's a little bit less used, because Protosses tend to get the robotics base so early. So there's really no reason to get, or to like start researching range and cancel it, and then do something like go Dark Templar. Because your opponent such a high percentage of the time will either have the detection he needs to kill off the Dark Templars, or he will have enough units to kill off whatever other nutty thing you were going for. And also, I'm kind of glad that in this game we haven't seen anything too insane happen. Whoops, that was kind of a little misstep by Backho. We haven't seen anything too insane, like a bunch of like proxy gates over here. There's a lot of times on match point the players have been doing that quite a lot, but things seem to be playing out very, very standardly. And notice the way that Backho's doing this, nothing too extreme. Going a little gangster here, some sort of like gangster thuggish elf style here. Not sure how much it suits him, but it's good to experiment with the fashion a little bit. We already see Backho going straight for the early range advantage. This is always good in order to help defend your expansion, and also it allows you to be a little bit aggressive early on. If you can get a range advantage against your opponent, that's always a good timing window to move out. But notice that there's 2 Zealots here. Early on in the history of StarCraft, players just thought that Zealots sucked, like, completely. Like, in early 2002, these sorts of times, players would just not get Zealots. But Zealots actually are really helpful. So if you have, like, 3 Dragoons and a Zealot against 2 Zealots and 2 Dragoons, the 2 Zealots and 2 Dragoons force the other Protoss to do a lot of walking back. You get a lot of extra ground, and if your opponent is not careful, then he ends up just losing way more than he needs to. So in this case, we have these Zealots that are kind of allowing our opponent to have a little bit more aggression here. But fortunately for Backho, because he got that range so early, he's able to repel it pretty easily. So both players doing an unbelievably standard sort of style of play. So Backho, he goes for the very early range, so he can get the range advantage and deal with early harassment that way. And then he's going straight for the Robo with the Observatory. That way he can defend this expansion pretty much against anything, and he can transition into Reaver if he wants to, which is actually almost certainly what he will and should do, in my opinion. And he gets a few opportunities to do early pressure, but he's not committed to doing early pressure by any means. This is a little bit more of standard what we'd see from Han right here. What Backho's doing is something that's a little bit cuter that players have been experimenting around with a little bit more lately, which is just ways to safely early expand without doing the usual one-base Reaver plays. And this is really nice ordering by Backho. I really like the way he expands and then starts adding on a whole bunch of gateways. I'm curious if that would be able to hold off some sort of 4-gate Dragoon style play. This is actually ultra standard by Han. I'll come back to the 4-gate Goon discussion in a little bit, but this is a good mix of typical Protoss vs. Protoss, with more new school sensibilities of taking this expansion early. He's getting the Observatory and the robotics bay really, really quickly with his Dragoon combination, but then he's also going straight for Reavers and getting 2 gateways very quickly. Backho's doing something almost similar, but he stuck with 1 gateway expanded and then added up to 3 gateways, so a little bit more of a newer variant from Backho. But what I was saying earlier about Backho is that I'm curious if Backho's play can hold off 4 gateway Dragoon or something like that, which is a really standard cheese style where you just kind of prevent your opponent from scouting you. You get 4 gateways, and then you just try to break him down with Dragoons. That's something that clearly I can't tell straight off the bat if Backho would be able to hold it off. But if you are doing something like this and you're playing and you're trying to do this style that you see Backho do in this game, I would definitely recommend having a friend try that against you. Say, I'm going to do this build, and I want you to try to go 4 gateway. I want you to have vision of me. I want you to do everything you can to cheese this build apart. Because the whole point of this build is to make sure you can get an early expansion and not die to any sort of cheesy BS. And if for some reason you are dying to that cheesy BS, probably something's going wrong. So yeah, look at this very, very normal play by Han. But the fact that he got this expansion means he's playing very, very defensively. He's playing really far back, really staying very, very tightly cramped back here. Backho is going to get a little bit more freedom to move around just because he has more gateway units. And I mean, Reavers are, even though you have the shuttle for them to help make them more mobile, shuttles and Reavers are still a very immobile part to an army. You really, I mean, again, assuming you don't have speed. At this stage of the game, they're definitely immobile. And they're doubly immobile because you really need a lot of units, a lot of defense around this shuttle to make it even do anything, to make it really effective, because you can get surrounded so easily with Reavers if you're not careful. So it's really, really important to make sure that your whole army is very, very well clumped together and that you're watching it. And as a result, Han can't really do any early aggression. A lot of movement around with the observers, trying to check around, make sure you're keeping count on your opponent's buildings, especially gateway count. It's pretty significant here. Getting around 4 gateways when you get the Citadel is another one of those standard numbers to look for. And it does look like Backho is in fact going for the mass gateway instead of going for the Reavers. So, see, that's the sort of thing you want to do. You want to go in, take 1 shot, and then back out. Don't do anything too extreme. Earlier on, I was saying Backho is likely to and probably should go for Reaver after he does this sort of opening. The reason I was saying that is because Backho's already invested in this really fast robotics facility, and it's important whenever you do something like that not to make sure its focus is purely not dying, to make sure that there's some extra little boost that you're getting from it. So for instance, if you make cannons to hold off vulture harass, you should make sure that you also are doing something with that forge, like researching a +1 attack upgrade, something totally normal like that. So here in this game, we have Backho going straight for the robotics facility. Probably should go for Reaver just because he's invested so much in robotics facility. And I say should there because if you can get away with going straight for gateway units here, that's an entirely reasonable thing to do. But in a lot of circumstances, the extra money you save by getting a robotics facility instead of having to get all those gateways and then start making Dragoons can be another way to hold off some things that you're having problems with. So I brought up the Reaver mainly as an option. It's a very reasonable thing to do. That's exactly what we saw Han do in this game right here. We see Han going for the fast observers and then going straight for Reavers, and he was using it defensively early on, if you note. This is the first time his Reavers actually moved out. That is the more typical way to do an early expanding style where you are getting the robotics facility so early. But naturally, as we're seeing right here, Backho gets to get all these gateways. This is actually his 5th and 6th gateway warping in right there. He ends up getting his first pieces to a much more mobile mid-game. And what I mean by that is that you're making all these Dragoons early on so that you don't die to any sort of Dragoon push or Dragoon Reaver push or to Reaver harass or Dark Templar harass. But as time goes on, you're going to start adding in more Speed Zealots and more Templar, and eventually your army's suddenly going to become mobile, much more mobile than if you have these Reavers, which is the option that Han's going for. And because you're so mobile, you have a lot more freedom to do things like maybe take a 4th expansion here, because again, if we look at the map, it's a lot of difficulty going for a 4th expansion if you're in Backho's position. Let's pause this real fast. I mean, getting the 3rd expansion, it's reasonably easy to defend this, especially because once you have this set up, this is a really easy amount of airspace to cover. Shuttles are going to have a hard time. Really, only this back path here is the reasonable angle for shuttles to come in, which is part of the reason why Backho has his units all the way here. But really, shuttles can't penetrate in this way. They can't come in this way, especially if you just plant a unit or two there. Maybe a cannon, this sort of thing. So, getting these 3 expansions is going to be very, very safe for Backho given his number of units. But because he's emphasizing all those, because he's emphasizing getting so many Dragoons early on, and then he's getting all those gateways so he can get so many Zealots and Templar later on, he's going to have a lot more freedom to move around the middle and take that 4th expansion. So a theme that we were discussing quite a bit in the Pusan vs. Zhangbi game is this idea of getting a whole bunch of Dragoons and then flooding with Zealots. That sort of alternation is clearly what Backho's going for a little bit earlier than what Han would be going for. Already getting Templar out very, very fast. I don't mind not getting Archons at this stage, because really, having the Archons, or excuse me, having the Storm for Reavers against a Dragoon Reaver army is going to be very, very helpful. I don't quite see the benefit of Archons, because you don't need the Archons and Zealots to push up and take this expansion. You can just as easily take it in the exact way Backho's doing it by getting a whole bunch of Dragoons. So, also, one thing I really like about Backho's play, and this is something that definitely I don't think is overrated in any way, this is easy to do. Like, really, you don't have to worry about Reaver and Shuttle controls. And Reaver and Shuttle controls hard. It's, like, impossible. Like, that is the main reason I didn't choose Protoss when I was a kid. Like, way back when I was, like, a fetus and I was trying to figure out what race I wanted to play in StarCraft. Reavers and Shuttles had just been invented. Like, it never dawned on people that they could just load the Reaver into a Shuttle. And my Reavers always died despite that. And it frustrated me so much to try to do that sexy thing where you unload and it would fire and you'd pick it up. But basically what happened is I would unload and the Reaver would wave and then it would just get picked up and nothing would fire. And it'd be like, alright, let's try that again. It would like not fire again and I would feel all embarrassed. And with Zerg, you just attack move with a bunch of Zerglings. That was a pretty easy choice. And that's why I like this style of Backho so much, is that it's stable, it's strong, it transitions well for the later stages of the game, and it's just Dragoons. Which, as you'll note, do have the worst AI in America, but it's still a lot better than Reavers and this sort of thing. Yeah, so see, look, I said that Reavers were going to have a lot of trouble penetrating right in here, and it looks like maybe there's an opening here, but the problem is that you do have to escape out across a very dangerous path. You have to escape out this way as Han. So I do appreciate that he's trying to do this shuttle harass, but always be aware of the paths you have to take in order to actually do harassment. Protoss vs. Protoss is a little bit unique in that you can do speed shuttle harass pretty effectively just because the speed shuttles are so fast. They're incredibly fast. But don't think, especially for any Terran users or Zerg users who are just tuning in because they love my soothing, calming voice, don't think that you can do that sort of harassment where your whole army's playing defensive and you dart in and dart out. That's kind of unique to Protoss as a race, being able to do that. Very defensive structure that we're seeing from Han. He used those Reavers defensively, and he's also incorporating them into his harassment. And look, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Look how easily Backho transitions into a very mobile army. He can just move right out. We're going to see this blob doing a whole lot of action in the middle. Already, in this circumstance, oh, that was a really cool fade. Let's look at that again. Look at the drama. My god, he's coming out with the big army. We have a shuttle moving down. Let's check out Best Glasses, and then look at I Love Uv. Oh, yeah. Oh, wait, wrong team. Yeah, I don't know whose glasses those are. And that's Busan. Yeah, all right. Sweet transition action. But look at this. Already with this big army positioning, just by walking out into the middle of the map, bam, 4th expansion, getting easy to defend. And it kind of sucks that there's a shuttle there. Ooh, do a lot of this. Do a lot of this. Where you send a probe a touch early, and you just start building pylons here. Because these are pylons that you're going to need, that you're just building normally to try to keep up with your supply count. But those are going to be instrumental in spotting. They're going to be instrumental in building cannons later. Oh, yeah, sweet harassment. It is okay to do that sort of sacking of shuttles to try to do some extra damage, but make sure you really do some extra damage. Again, that speed shuttle is very unique to Protoss, so if you can get some really good storms off, by all means, go for it. But don't make that the fundamental framework of your game, is to sack like 20 shuttles and to do retarded amounts of harassment damage, unless you really know what you're doing. So again, these Reavers, a very, very muscular unit the Reaver is, but very, very slow. Your army cannot do the sorts of things that we're seeing Backho's army do. Look at all this space that Backho has. Look, he has this huge ring of space. And I mean, the two players are in pretty similar situations. I mean, just from looking at the minimap, it looks like Backho's been adding on a few more gateways at the top. But up until recently, almost identical number of gateways. But because Backho skipped those Reavers altogether and instead opted for more gateways, they were even at those stages of the game. Backho clearly didn't have any harassment potential, but now he gets to walk out into the middle of the map completely free. Naturally, Han is aware of his lack of mobility, which is why he's emphasizing harassment early on. So here comes, hopefully, a totally sweet confrontation. Because, again, we do watch StarCraft not just for fun analysis, but also to watch stuff blow up. Oh, a little bit of an AI battle going on there. Oh yeah, don't do that. Be real careful with your units. And honestly, controlling big armies like this, I mean, I don't want to be like, ha ha ha, LOL, don't do this, I'm so funny. I mean, the main reason I bring that up is really, it can be very easy to lose track of units and this sort of thing, but if you look at the minimap a lot and control your army through the minimap, that can help quite a bit, just becoming comfortable with moving really large armies just by clicking. Let's actually just go back to the screen. I mean, if we have 3 control groups here with this red army, and even like 4 with Backho, as we can see even more units coming in, it's really easy just to 1 click, 2 click, 3 click, 4 click right there to move that blob of units. Also allows you to macro easier. You're also looking at the mini-map while you're doing it, so it makes holding off speed shuttle harassment a little bit easier. Reavers are kind of caught in the middle of nowhere. Curious about that decision. So this is very, very good by Backho. I want to briefly note the way that this army moved. So this army is moving up north. And as it's moving up here, putting a threat mainly at this expansion. We actually saw just beforehand the Reavers did their slug walk all the way back up here with the rest of the Dragoons. The units were taken away from here. And that is when this expansion starts going down. You see so much of that with good players. And it's really, really subtle because it's so fun to just look at what the action is. But look at this. Moving to the right, putting pressure right here while we're building more defenses here. And pulls away to the left side. I would be leery of pulling to the left to have my opponent just cut down and cut me off. But really, this army composition of Han isn't nearly fast enough to exploit that and set up some really good position. I would be more concerned about, for instance, if Backho were Protoss and red were Zerg. If Zerg cut down and burrowed lurkers here, they could totally demolish this expansion with ease. And you might want to cut back this way, cut south if you're Backho, but cutting to the left, no problem with this decision whatsoever. And that actually is probably the biggest mistake Protoss players make in all 3 matchups is mid-game unit movement. And when I say biggest, there's obviously problems like macro, and like not knowing what to do is a pretty big issue. But I should probably say an overlooked issue is troop movement. They'll just kind of move away and not think of the implications of it. But really, for instance, moving away and then cutting right back around again. See, here's more of Han's game plan. I have such an immobile army. This sucks, but I have these speed shuttles because I want Reavers. Let me actually restate that. Han says, oh, I went for Reavers in order to hold everything, but that forces me to have a much more immobile army. Therefore, I will do this sort of harassment with speed shuttles because it incorporates well with Reavers. Yeah, awesome harass. It's also good to have a little bit of... There's I'll call it standard clairvoyance whenever you do these sorts of drops, which is, for instance, maybe we'll get a look at a mineral patch in a little bit, but you end up storming once in a normal spot, and then storming where you think all the units will run. So, yep, see, right there is the issue. Even the commentator, look at that pause. That was a great pause by me. We even get the box. We're starting to see the danger of trying to harass anywhere in here, because if you try to exit, I mean, there was one Dragoon here that killed it, but there's also all these guys right here that can kill off that shuttle. A lot of players would be like, oh, that's such bad luck that Dragoon ended up killing that off, and they'll ignore the fact that there's just a giant blob of 5,000-6,000 units or so hanging out right there ready to kill you. But really, harassing right there is great. But so, for instance, if I drop here, I might want to storm once here, but then I'll also throw a storm right there over the geyser. Always good to know where you'd want to run as that player, and then just storm right there, because you can end up with just outrageous amounts of kills. Also notice the way that these players are expanding. If we look at the map, this is much more of a blobby choice of expansion, and I'm going to defend my word choice there. When you have a big army blob, you want to just move back and forth between these two locations. This is pretty close. This is a pretty small distance here. Whereas, which is, again, why we're expanding here instead of, say, here. Because if we expand here, we do have to cover this whole region. We do have to worry about units coming up here and taking us out. And if we move units up here, then we have to worry about counterattacks coming here. This is a little bit easier, given the fact that you can just bounce back and forth here as Han, so I do defend his choice of expanding right there. But notice Backho, with his huge mid-game center control, he was free to take this fourth much, much earlier, and as a result, he'll probably end up taking his fifth over here much, much earlier. I'm not sure if I would expand here as my fifth base as Backho, just because very clearly with these troop movement, that expansion is the clear, easier to defend choice. Well, here we go. Our first confrontation. Seeing those probes in there, that's always good. So I say this a lot in Protoss vs. Protoss battles. You want your Zealots hitting your opponent's Dragoons with a little bit of Dragoon backup. And you want your Zealots avoiding your opponent's Archons. So a lot of good storms coming off. We'll probably end up rewatching this battle a pretty significant number of times. And by that I mean 2, upwards of 3 times. Let's watch exactly what happened, because Protoss vs. Protoss battles are just out of control. There's quite a few things to actually focus on, and all of them are pretty key. There's a lot of storming, and then there's all the positioning of the Zealots, the dodging of the storms, and the positioning of the Dragoons. So let's watch these first few storms. Hits these Dragoons down here. Always good to throw some storms at the Dragoons. You'll always notice Zealots clustering up like this. Look, one Zealot was right there. He's in the process of exploding right there. And it's important to see how that happens. Like, if you just send up a Zealot here, your opponent's Zealots will naturally close in around it, and you can get in free storms there sometimes. So here's some more storming going on. Just look at the way this blob's set up. A lot of Backho's units are all the way back here. Clearly Backho is trying to cut in, like, if we just look at the main screen, try to cut in here and have an arc starting here and going all the way back up and then past here to get a good concave, but it didn't end up working so well. And the reason that Backho ends up backing off is that look at this Dragoon count here. relative to this Dragoon count here. I would honestly say that's the main reason that Backho has to pull out here, is that's just such a huge Dragoon arc. That's absolutely enormous. And the storming was pretty standard there. Also, storming your opponent's Templar is another key thing to focus on. So, in battles, it depends a little bit on your unit composition, what you really want to focus storming on. Storming your opponent's Templar is always good. It can't be bad to target your opponent's Templar. I mean, obviously, they don't have any energy, because they were hallucinating. Yeah, in that case, definitely, it's okay not to storm your Templar. But in all the other cases, like in 100% of games, definitely storming the your opponent's Templar can't possibly be bad. And I think that's a Manor Pylon. I think that's a red pylon. I can't quite tell, but notice that Backho is expanding around the time that he's putting more pressure down there. Another one of those things to think about. But a lot more Dragoons out for Han. Han did get Templars a little bit later than his opponent, so that's why he has a few more Dragoons. Also, it's in line with his theme of having a very, very immobile army. A lot of Zealots here from Backho, because Backho is building so many Dragoons early on, and has pretty much just been flooding Zealots, Archons, and Templars since then. Han, on the other hand, had a fairly immobile army, and in order to back up those Reavers, we do need quite a few Dragoons in that mix. So see, look at that beautiful storm. That is just an awesome storm. These units were clustering around these few Zealots. We can actually just go back and see that in action. Because a lot of the super good Protoss players just have this unbelievable storm placement, and anytime they're in an even battle, they always come out on top. So here comes a nice little cluster there. Look at this. Just a few units that led out, and all these other units just trying to loop around to kill off those one or two. Our Archons here, I shouldn't say our, I just pick the winning player and group him together with we. Yeah, but red here, the Archons are against the opponent's Zealots. Great, that's what we want. And our Zealots are against our opponent's Dragoons. That's also what we want. And naturally, we want our Dragoons killing our opponent's Archons. So there should be some good storms coming up here, I'd imagine. And see, as these clusters start to form of Zealots, those are the ones you want to be looking for. Those are where the storm's going to happen. So there was one storm right there. Look at that. Look out. Look how many Zealots are not there anymore. There were so many here just 2 seconds ago. Look at the Zealot count. There's probably about 12 Zealots here. So we briefly go down here. These are the Archons versus Zealots going on right here. There's one storm there. Gone. Where did those Zealots go? Really nice job. And here's the Reavers who are coming in to just put a little bit more hurt on. Super, super awesome job. That almost seemed counterintuitive in a lot of cases, because Han pretty much was staying back, playing very defensively, trying to do some harassment, and it was Backho that was coming out with this really big, flashy army and everything. But somehow, Han ends up just miraculously winning. He just walks in there. These Reavers didn't even really participate in the battle too much. And if you have those bits of confusion, have no fear, for we will end up exploring that quite a bit when we re-review the game and when we open it up to questions. And good game. Feeling a little bit embarrassed. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute the chat just to get ready to have people... Well, actually, let's just leave him muted for now, and then we'll re-review the game a little bit. Really high Dragoon count. Oh, yeah, so, by the way, right here, at this stage in the game, I would label both players as even. Really nothing too extravagant going on. Now, I always label Dragoons as a very muscular unit. They end up being very, very strong. If you have any sort of concave advantage over your opponent, you can absolutely crush, which is a lot of stuff we saw happening right here in the game. But the problem is Dragoons are not particularly mobile. So let's actually pause and look at the map. So I see two different game plans going on. From Han's saying, well, this expansion is pretty easy to hold. So if I get Reavers early on with my expansion, I can hold it pretty easily. Excuse me. I can hold it pretty easily right here. And then I can just kind of wander down here and take it. And I can focus on doing a bunch with these 3 bases. by going for Reavers, I'm not planning on taking a fourth anytime soon because Reavers are so immobile, and I really will need a really big army position here to do anything. Backho, on the other hand, is saying only your first 3 expansions are easy to take. So, I am going to get an army that's very mobile so I can take a 4th and a 5th a lot sooner. Those are the 2 plans that we see in action. And what I do love about Han, I mean, this is very, very standard, but it's an example of something you should always be trying to do, which is, Han said, oh, I'm getting Reavers for defense, and I'm getting speed shuttles from this robotics bay, from this support bay, so I'm going to harass despite the fact that everything else I'm doing is defensive. And this harassment is seamless. I'm not doing anything weird. I'm not doing anything... I'm not going down 2 paths to do 2 different things. He's going down 1 path. He's going down the robotics facility path, and then he's doing defense with the Reavers, and then he's doing harassment with the speed shuttles. For instance, it would be weird, and it would be like choppy and bumpy if he went Reavers for defense early on, and then threw in a Templar Archives to do either Dark Templar or Storm Harass really early on. We did see Han do harassment later with Dark Templar and with High Templar, but only after he got the Templar Archives at a normal stage in the game. He focused on just Reaver harass early on, and then only later did he end up incorporating that. Very, very smooth. Very good planning on his part. But everything's very normal by both players leading up to this stage in the game. But yeah, so Backho ends up taking this expansion and can move out very, very early. This shuttle harassment, I think, was part of the reason why Backho was able to, or why Backho ended up falling behind. But I also think the fact that there was so much emphasis on just high-tech gas units from Han. A gassier army composition is a much more muscular, much more harder to break army composition. The fact of the matter is, if you spend a whole bunch on Zealots early on, you have the ability to be aggressive. You tend to have more units, so that's what makes it okay to get that many Zealots early on. But look how defensively Han is playing. Yeah, see, look, this is something I was saying earlier. If you Storm drop, you want to do something like Storm here, and then Storm here. That was pretty potent little storm drop there. But look at Han staying all the way back. The fact that Han was so defensive in everything he was doing is what allowed him to get so many Dragoons early on. See, these Zealots are not really going to be able to do much when they're walking up this thin ramp. And even with this fat ramp up here, the fact that Han hasn't even moved across it yet, and Reavers and his rally point are going to be there, are instrumental in defending at this stage in the game. So we see some Zealots and Templar being added, but mainly Dragoons. Mainly Dragoons. So right here, we see an economic advantage slowly building. I don't know whether or not Backho could have killed this army. I definitely think Backho could have killed these 2 Reavers right here. But that's something that a lot of players have this problem where they end up... They'll try to be aggressive at some stage in the game. They'll try to move out and do some big attack or something like that, and they'll die. So they'll say, oh, well, let me not do that anymore. So they end up playing increasingly passive over time. If you ever feel yourself doing that, try to just attack. Like in this position, just say, well, I don't really know if I could have won this attack, so let me just go ahead and try it. Always try to throw in something that might seem a little bit wildly aggressive and a little bit over the top, because it is so important just to make sure that you're not missing an opportunity. You don't want to force opportunities that aren't there. That's actually something that July's guilty of. And see, look, storming in the running path. So July is very guilty of trying to force opportunities that aren't actually there. So he'll end up trying to do big attacks all the time in serious matches, but... if you're practicing a lot and you're feeling pretty confident, like in Backho's stage right here, just go ahead and do a little attack throw out in maybe like 10% of your games, just to make sure that nothing weird's happening. Like, just to make sure you are in fact taking advantage of situations. You should be. And see, here's the nice blobby army. Still so defensive from Han. Han has not crossed this line of the map. Backho went all the way up here. That's the key difference in unit composition from this right here. But Han, on the other hand, is just staying so far back, so tightly packed. And as a result, he can emphasize not so many zealots, more dragoons. Look at that. Lots and lots and lots of dragoons. And also using the fact that he got Reavers early, and therefore speed shuttles early to move out. A few things that we should just note in this base. Look at that. 1, forge researching. 2, forge researching. Plenty of gateways and this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, a whole lot of important timing pushes line up with upgrades. And that's something that a lot of low-level players are aware of, and they're familiar with like +1 timing attacks. Say in Protoss for Zerg, getting the +1 attack upgrade to kill with Zerglings, or to kill Zerglings very, very easily. But it's also those ones in the late game that become really instrumental. So I'm actually going to check for that as we rewatch this game right here. So for instance, Flash's +2, +1 timing push. So let's actually see if we can click on any units. Like, yeah, Flash's +2, +1 timing push is an example of that late game upgrade advantage. See, look at that. Look how many dragoons there are. And there's so many more zealots in Backho's army than there are. Look, there's tons and tons of zealots in Backho's army. Even ended up losing some before and still has so many left. And it just is not going to be nearly effective against this giant, massive army. So still 0-0 here. I would imagine it'd be like 0-1 or so. We're 1-1 at Backho's side, but I want to make sure that Han ends up pushing right when he can. I think that's 2-0. That looks like 2-0. Yeah, we see right here. It happens real fast, so. So here it's 2-0, and right as this push is happening, you're going to see the +1 armor upgrade pop out. See, there's +1 armor right there. Always good to make sure you have an attack coming right around the time an upgrade is going to finish. So that pretty much sums up my thoughts on that game. I also just want to say, for the record, that is the first time I've seen this game. I actually knew that this game happened, that it was relatively long, and just went ahead and watched it straight up. And I think it's important to do that from time to time, just to naively watch a game, don't even know the results, don't know anything about what happened. So what you can do, and what you should do, is just talk to yourself at your computer and try to identify what people's game plans are as time is going on. So, I mean, I was aware that Han was being very defensive and playing back, but it became much more clear at the end of the game what the goal was. And it was very useful to identify, oh, hey, it looks like he's playing defensive. So that way I could go, oh, so we can get so many more Dragoons, we can have such a stronger unit combination, and that sort of thing. So I will gladly open it up to just a few questions. I have a meeting in about 15 minutes here. So let's just go ahead and take some questions before then. So Lal says, why did White get so many Zealots? Zealots are less effective against many Dragoons, let alone Archons and Reavers. If White got Goons instead, would he have won? So I'm going to answer those in two parts. I'm going to ignore the if he got Dragoons, would he have won? And focus on the why did White get so many Zealots. The reason why White got so many Zealots is because it allows him to move out at a stage in the game when he wants to accomplish something. Expanding is almost always the biggest reason. So let's moving right along. Right here, yeah, look at this. So right now is when the speed zealots start to pop out. And look, see, Backho's been playing very, very, well, really back. He hasn't been moving forward, same way with Han. But then all of a sudden, speed zealots come out. Boom, we can move out really, really aggressively with the army. Maybe we can attack this expansion, maybe we can attack the natural, but most importantly, we can take this expansion completely and totally free. And you see this a lot more often on a map like Destination, where it's a little bit harder to secure a third gas just by walking there. Like, if we just actually look over at Fighting Spirit, you can walk right up to your third gas, and it is totally defended. You just build some pylons there, make a little wall, and you're done. Great. You're in fantastic shape. You did it. You're defended. You're the man. But on Destination, you really do need units in order to secure your expansion, and that is an example of when you see Zealots. as a necessity, and it's much clearer. Here, because the third is so easy to defend, Han was probably aware of the threat of Zealots and the fact that he would not be able to be aggressive if his opponent went for that really fast Zealot play, which is what Backho did. So Han responds by playing super defensively and negating the benefit of those Zealots, which I think is a very, very excellent sort of transition. So let's continue to take questions. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to answer Lol's second question, which is, if White had gotten more Dragoons, would he have won? I think that White should have immediately shifted to not only adding on more gateways, but trying to, I guess, less of saying, well, he just should have gotten Dragoons and he would have won, but more of doing stuff with the units he got, because anytime you go for that really aggressive Zealot composition in your army, so much of your food is comprised of Zealots, and you end up with more units than your opponent. So by this logic, it means that if we get to maxed, we have unit composition we don't want. We have too many Zealots. But for instance, if earlier on here, Backho had was able to attack right here, his gateway advantage and his aggressive composition maybe could have taken out this army, maybe could have done some serious damage there. I think that's what those Zealots should have done, should have tried to do that sort of thing, and that's why I emphasize so much that maybe Backho should have done sort of early, some sort of attacking at that stage, and why it's so important, like 10% of the time, to just attack there, to make sure that you're not losing an opportunity, which may have been the case in this game. I don't know if just suddenly getting Dragoons when you see your opponent being defensive is the solution, but I think that's something to play around with. Yarko asks, in Protoss vs. Protoss, I find myself lacking good timings for attacks and end up entirely too passive. What are some good triggers to initiate an attack in PvP? That's actually a good sign if that's the big issue you're having, because that really is one of like the fundamental hearts of Protoss vs. Protoss, having good timing with that. A lot of the matchup revolves around that. What I would say is start thinking about when you want to expand, and then make your attacks coincide with that. So actually, if we go back to this game, even though Backho lost this game, really good timing with when he expands. I mean, notice right here, there's some preparations here, but no expansion yet, and watch this blob. I want you to note the movement of this blob and when this nexus begins. Check this out. This is actually really cool to watch. Look, him moving right up here, right as he gets up to the expansion, and the farther north he moves, there, boom, expansion coming down. And likewise, we see more unit movement coming around here, and then bam, there's another expansion coming down right there. The reason I say think about expansions for triggers and this sort of thing is that it becomes very clear when you need to be moving forward and putting a little pressure on your opponent. And also, all of your, how do I say this? Your gateway unit production timing ends up lining up really nicely. So for instance, if you think to yourself, hey, I want to take my fourth coming up... sorry, I'm just waiting to make sure I don't say anything I don't want. I'm just waiting for the thoughts to gel properly. Okay, here we go. So, let's say you think to yourself, I want to get my fourth expansion at the time that Backho did. I want to kind of play defensively, take my expansions, but then I want to take my fourth, and that's going to be hard to do. Play one game or two, and be aware of around the time you're going to be taking that fourth expansion. 4 or 5 minutes before you do that, get the Citadel, start getting speed, start flooding with a ton of Zealots, and then when you move out, you will have a really strong army for that period of time, and that is when you'll be expanding. That's always a really great way, I feel, because that Zealot flood timing is so important. That if you can line it up with your expanding, you won't end up being this out-of-control aggressive player who always wins with these brilliant attacks. But what will end up happening instead is that you will be that player that frustrates your opponents because it always feels like you're getting so many expansions up. And what's even better about what I just described is that it forces you to play longer and longer games, so you get more practice. You get more practice for the late game and these sorts of things. So that, I think, is a good, simple starting point to learn for triggers to attack, to look for opportunities, is right when you're expanding, and to base everything around that. So Scrix asks, it seemed like once Han had crossed the bridge, it was over. Would it have been better... Oops, I lost track of your question because of scrolling. Yeah, it seemed like once Han had crossed the bridge, it was over. Wouldn't it have been better to keep watch over the bridge rather than send everything to kill 2 pylons? Let's see. Sending everything to kill... I just want to make sure I'm understanding the point that you are referring to. So I'm going to be scrolling ahead in my video here. And I'm going to take another question. So I'm actually going to pause it right here and say, was it before here, Scrix, or was it after? Are you talking about when Backho moved up here to kill these things off or not? If you can just clarify that, I'd be happy to answer your question. So we'll come back to Scrix's question, because I think it is useful to note when armies are moving out towards the center of the map, especially considering how drastically different the styles were. Double Mackin asks, would you say that Storm and Templar management was key to winning the game? And what could Backho have done to best counter that? I would say it was instrumental. For some reason, I feel like if I say that it's key, that implies that that's the reason he ended up winning it. I think there was a whole lot going into it, but definitely I think that was a fundamentally important thing that went on, because really, if you have Han's unit composition, just a few zealots, and then just a lot of gas units, your opponent's zealots, and Backho had plenty of zealots, ended up clustering, and those few storms just wiped out huge portions of those zealots. So that was really, really hard for Backho to come back from that. So I definitely think that that what Backho could have done to counter it was actually to be more aggressive earlier on. Because to think about it in terms of food, because Han is going for this very gassy, muscular army, he'll end up having maybe 120 food around the time that Backho has 150, 160 food. These are just sort of arbitrary numbers I'm throwing out, but basically Backho has more food at that stage in the game, and that's really the point in time that Backho wants to be attacking. Backho's done this zealot-intensive army. He has more units, so he needs to surround and flank. So actually, if we just go back to the screen that I have paused, right around here, if Backho was able to hit it from the bottom and hit it from the side, the storms would have done significantly less damage, and it would have been a lot better of a situation, I think, for Backho. But then again, I have no idea if Han was totally prepared for that and would have just crushed it right there. But that is something that I think should have been a focus of Backho's play, is to be aggressive in spots like that. Oh, I see Scrix's question. Scrix just clarified this a little bit. Totally understand. Let me just go back over this, because this is just an awesome question. I just want to make sure that everyone is on my page, and it might be the case that I was the only one who was confused. So, haha. So basically, Scrix points out that if we look at this line, actually, let's bring up the map. If we look at this line, that is, Han did not move across that. But there was a point when Han took his little blob and just went loop and moved right there. And Scrix is saying, why didn't Backho defend right there? Why didn't Backho put all his efforts on surrounding that right there? So if we just keep moving a little bit farther forward, see right here, this is what Scrix is talking about. All these units are moving over here to kill some pylons. And by the way, I didn't mention too much about this, but definitely feel free to build pylons at random places around the map to spot shuttles that are incoming. But so here, we have a little bit of movement going on by Backho, but then look, free chance to move across the bridge. And hey, look, all these units were here. Why didn't these units stay here? Scrix asks. I would say that it's always very dangerous to try to flank and kill your opponent right when he exits his base. I think it is possible to do the same exploit a little bit later, because essentially what we're saying is, and let's actually do this with the map. What we're saying is, if we have armies positioned right here, when Han moves out here, Backho can crush it, and then Backho has a really nice big concave to this really small concave from Han. I think, though, that if you just let Han wander out here, you still have the opportunity to hit it from all sides, given the mobile unit composition. I think it would be more important to secure the bridge if you had more Reavers, because Reavers are not very surround-friendly. You don't really say, well, I surrounded my opponent with a bunch of Reavers. Normally you have your Reavers really tightly packed together, and you have a bunch of Dragoons that are defending those Reavers, and the Reavers are sort of in key spots. But if you have a unit mix that is as aggressive as Backho's, if you have that many Zealots, I think it's more okay to let your opponent move across the bridge to gauge his size, and then to still be able to hit it, because you have so many more units. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's over once he crossed the bridge. I would say, I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it was over when he crossed the bridge. I think that, for instance, if you were going Dragoon Reaver and your Backho, and you have your opponent contained, and you move over to kill those pylons, and your opponent crosses the bridge, that is a situation where I'd be like, wow, yeah, you're totally doomed. But I love that line of thought. Just how can you control keeping your opponent in? And I'm glad we got to talk about it. Weehoo. Do the evolution asks a cool question. You were putting emphasis on mobility, but goons as core of our army slow it down anyways. So is this mobility only an illusion? Honestly, I feel like a Protoss army is only as fast as its Zealots. Dragoons are a reasonably fast unit. They're not too slow. I guess I would call them average speed. But the speed Zealots allow them to move a lot more quickly. What tends to slow the Dragoons down is Templar and Reavers, which you'll obviously need because you can't have a just Dragoon army. So really the Dragoons end up being a core of any Protoss army because you end up building so many Dragoons early on. And the question is, do we transition into Templar and Zealots with leg speed and that army, or do we transition to Reavers? And those two are what I would identify as the fast army with the Zealots and the Templar, and the slow army. So I would say that Dragoons are pretty slow. I wouldn't say the mobility is necessarily an illusion, because really the Zealots are so fast that they allow you to cut into places. So let's actually just take a brief look at the map. For instance, let's say Backho sees this expansion. I didn't change the screen over. Let me do that. Wah! There we go. So let's say Backho saw this expansion, and Han was starting to slowly move south, and Backho is right here. What can happen is the Speed Zealots can cut here really quickly, and then move back up. If it was just Dragoons, they would end up getting right to about here when Han was about here, and you wouldn't necessarily get that advantage. So those are my thoughts on that speed. And we only have one more question. So Nitro Point says, why didn't Han get more Reavers or use shuttle with the 2 Reavers during the big fights? You say Han doesn't have a mobile army, but with shuttles, it is mobile. Alright, how do I answer that question? That was kind of a 2-part question. So, let's do the first one. So first of all, why didn't Han get more Reavers in this game? I think it's because he's naturally transitioning to just getting more Templar and Dragoons. And really, there's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis you have to do with the Reavers. I mean, if you start getting into like 4 to 6 Reavers, the higher numbers you get, the less effective really you're ending up being. And what ends up happening is that even though Reavers can do a whole bunch of damage and are very, very strong, once the armies get really, really big, the Templar with the Storm end up being much more effective because they can just do more damage on the whole. So that's why players end up shifting towards Templar as the game progresses. I would say then I think a reasonable follow-up question is, well, why did Han end up getting Reavers at all? Really what I feel happened is that Han got the Reavers early on for defense, and then as he's transitioning on to his late-game army, he leaves the Reavers around because, hey, they're Reavers and they're going to do a bunch of damage and they're going to be awesome and helpful anyways. And also, why didn't he get the speed shuttle? I would say partly because he was spending so much money on harassment, and you know what? I think he should have gotten the speed shuttle. I think it couldn't have hurt to get it. There was all sorts of micro going on, so what I would say is that it would be hard to control that army with like the Storm, the Archons, looking for those Zealot clumps, and having a Reaver bounce around, and you're trying to like unload it and move it in all these funky places. It's honestly just easier to attack move with Reavers and let their slow asses sort of drag around the map. So honestly, yes, you could get the shuttle clearly in an optimal setting. If we can control really well, the shuttle's absolutely going to help. Nitro Point, totally dead on the money there. But it is hard, and I believe Han was probably just like, go army, and then focus a whole bunch more on storming and Dragoon placement. So yeah, that about wraps that up. We've just hit 1 hour of recording, and I'm really happy that no lag came in and ruined everything. So I actually have to run off to my meeting, but thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. And as a little bit of bonus, we're going to be doing Jaedong versus Bisu tomorrow. Jaedong versus Bisu on Destination, because we've done 2 Jaedong versus Bisus on Destination. We will end up doing yet another one, so that way we can check some of those out. And good requests are also coming in, especially from foreigner games, because WCG just happened. So definitely post some of those more in the live thread. And that about wraps things up. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Peace out.